epic fantasy, dark fantasy, high fantasy, or even erotic fantasy? What type of fantasy is your story? Hello and welcome to the Bottled Imp, exploring the realms of fantasy. My name is Ken Boyter and this is part 3 of our writing fantasy and imp's journey. Now, I'm no writing expert, but I have written a children's epic fantasy illustrated story, and I thought I would share this journey with you guys because, well, hey, you're into fantasy, I'm into fantasy, and if you like writing fantasy or you're thinking of writing fantasy, I thought it'd be helpful to do some hints and tips, just kind of what I've discovered on my imp journey. Anyway, let's kick off. So, part 1, we covered ideas, inspiration, and why are you writing, your urge to write. Part 2, we covered creating your fantasy world and covering some good reference books. And part 3, today, we're going to be covering what type of fantasy is your story, the basic story structure, and also what are your theme or themes of your fantasy story. So, what type of fantasy is your story? And I think that's quite important to nail down before you even start doing anything, really. And the reason why I say that is fantasy is a subject is, well, what is fantasy for a start? It's a bit of a debate. And, you know, that's maybe for another day, obviously. But there is, broadly speaking, about 7 categories, subgenres of fantasy. Now, according to Darin Park in the Complete Guide to Writing Fantasy, Volume 1, he says there are about 7. And I'll just quickly list them there and then we'll go through them in a little bit more detail. So we have epic fantasy, high fantasy, sword and sorcery, dark fantasy, contemporary fantasy, historical fantasy, and erotic fantasy. Yeah. Let's start with epic fantasy though. That is basically the foundation of modern fantasy, and that's what everybody, if you say fantasy, this is what really, if people who aren't into fantasy and don't really know anything else, this is the fantasy type that they will be thinking of. It's Lord of the Rings, it's The Hobbit, it's medieval with magic, it's that kind of fantasy. But it does have other characteristics that are different from the other types of fantasy. These are big in scope. They're normally over 100,000 words, so they're big tomes, and they deal with the biggest possible issues, such as saving the world, rescuing an entire universe from the forces of darkness, and they generally have a big final, they're all leading up to a big final battle between good and evil. So it's that apocalyptic sort of event that's going to happen. So they're big issue stories, and that is really what epic fantasy is. And then we have high fantasy, which is very closely related to epic fantasy. Now, these stories are a little bit more personal than epic fantasies, and they're more limited to the needs and desires of an individual hero. So the protagonist is the focus of a single, and also a single villain as well. So you've got a protagonist who's up against a single villain, and it's their personal goals and motivation that drive the story. Yes, there might be a bigger story happening in the background, but that's generally not the focus. And then we have sword and sorcery. Now this category is similar in scope, but there's less focus on world building, and there's more focus on the actual action, on the spirit of action, and really moving the plot quite quickly. Now these tend to be axe swinging kind of heroes and barbarians, so think Conan the Barbarian basically. And they're determined to slay their enemies. They've got some sort of revenge mission, or they're just bloodthirsty for whatever reason. There's normally some sexy femme fatales that they need to rescue. It's not necessarily my kind of fantasy, but it is a very popular type of fantasy. It's basically there's a bad guy, and that bad guy needs to be killed by the good guy. And there's not too much nuance in there. Dark fantasy, on the other hand, that shouldn't be confused with horror, because dark fantasy isn't necessarily about food. It's not necessarily, I can't even say that word. Yay, let's add that to the group of words I can't say. That's not basically, does that work? It's not meant to be scary. So dark fantasy isn't horror because it doesn't have to be scary. It just deals with those dark, horror-esque themes. So also in dark fantasy, the heroes may not win, and it may not be the traditional hero either. You can have lots of anti-heroes in dark fantasy, and they're people who have, their morality and ethics are questionable. They're not necessarily always going to be doing the good thing. But again, they might be. So they're quite fascinating characters to write, anti-heroes. Now, the world building in this is equally dark, and there are stories where evil has trumped over good. So you've already established that good is losing. And it's basically the survival of the fittest, and virtue isn't necessarily its own reward. So there's a lot to think about with dark fantasy. Contemporary fantasy, otherwise known as urban fantasy, now that mixes with the horror genre as well, but the focus is more on monsters, especially vampires and werewolves. They seem to be very popular at the moment in contemporary fantasy. Think Twilight. It's unlike horror though, because again, it doesn't have to scare you. It might, but it doesn't have to. And I think with horror, out and out horror, that's one of its prime objective, isn't it? Is to scare you. These ones aren't necessarily set in a fantasy location. They're actually set, I guess this is why people call it contemporary and urban, because they're set in the real world. And they're normally set in the present day as well. Now, there might be elements, there might be portals into other worlds, or there might be the supernatural coming into our world. That is all in contemporary fantasy. And then we have historical fantasy, and that's solid grounding in the real world, but a real world of years ago, or even, centuries past. And it doesn't have to be medieval. You can have fantasy in other eras as well. So authors do have the entire world history to explore. So you can, why not set fantasy in Victorian England, or, the Civil War in America, or even, Japan. So there's lots of scope for you to actually have a good setting, but it has to be kind of in history and a real life history. There are endless possibilities with this one. And then lastly, we have erotic fantasy. Now, I don't really read erotic fantasy, so I don't know too much about it. But it's the main objective. It's also known as fantasy romance as well. But the main aspect is sex or romance. It doesn't just focus on sex, but that's the prime storyline, if you like. Now, I think it's a good idea to put sex and romance in other categories. So if you're writing a dark fantasy, have a romance running through that, but tune that into dark fantasy. So it could be a doomed love story, as opposed to it's all going to work out and it's going to be happy, because that really wouldn't fit dark fantasy. But erotic fantasy does mainly focus on the sex and romance. And then we have story structure. So why is it important to have story structure? Well, I think it's quite a good map for your characters, and it does keep your writing focused, because if it kind of stops you from going off too many tangents, and then your whole novel can become unwieldy. This does keep you focused. So if you know that, and it doesn't have to be, you don't have to plot it out in fine detail, although some authors do, but as long as you know sort of maybe main events, that can keep you on track. It also, as I say, it does break your story into manageable chunks so you don't get overwhelmed. And it does keep track of your story arcs and your character arcs as well. Now, there are lots of different structures, but there is a classic 3-act structure, and that is simply the beginning, middle, and end. And that is used quite a lot. That's the main one that most people use. But as I say, there are others. We haven't got time to go into all of that, but we'll just quickly go through the beginning, middle, and end. So Act 1 the beginning. That's where you establish your protagonist, and basically they do recommend you do that on page 1 or as close as it, because then people know that he or she is your main character right from the get-go. And it also establishes a viewpoint. Should you do it from the first point of view, or should you do it from the third point of view? Very tricky to do it from the second point of view. Ian Banks has done that, and he did that very well in Complicity, but it's not necessarily for the novice, the second point of view. It also establishes the conflict that the protagonist will have between the antagonist or any other characters. And there might be a few subplots that you start to write about in Act 1. Act 2, you continue all of that, so it carries on from Act 1, but then you complicate them as much as you can, put loads of twists in, really surprising events happen to keep your audience interested. Think Game of Thrones, if you've read or seen Game of Thrones. And your character situation should be getting worse, not better, basically, in Act 2. Act 2 is traditionally the longer of all the acts, because that's where things really develop. And then you move on to Act 3, and that's where you start wrapping all of your subplots and all of your main plots up, basically. And as I say, towards the end, you're building up to a resolution. Now, it doesn't have to be a happy resolution, but everything needs to tie up, because that gives the audience, the reader, satisfaction. And a good story structure book that I recommend is by William Bernard, and it's called Story Structure: The Key to Successful Fiction, and that's in the Red Sneaker Writers book series. I recommend that one. There are plenty out there as well. Now, so it's a good idea to just write an outline of the scenes as well, because then again you'll know what leads on. But some authors don't do that. Some authors, once they've got their characters in their head, they just start writing and they see where it takes them. And that's perfectly valid. There isn't really a right or wrong way. But I guess if you're starting out, it's always good to kind of follow certain known rules that work for writers. And then as you get more experience, then you can start breaking them if you want to. And lastly, theme. What is theme? Or, has your book got any theme or themes in it? And it's very important, because that's the way that your readers will connect to your book on a human, emotional level. And that's what you want. That's what gives your book depth. It's the pulse of the story, basically, and it's got to appeal to the reader and you, because you're going to be writing this book for quite a while. You're going to invest a lot of time and emotion into it, hopefully. So you need to find your theme or themes appealing. It needs to speak to you. And when it does, you will be writing authentically. So you might have had experience about your theme and you want to put it into your book. That is so powerful. Examples of theme are ambition, alienation, death, freedom. What else have I got here? Loss of life, innocence, survival, power. And all the way through your novel, that theme should be there, like a drumbeat in the background, constantly reminding, because that will keep the audience connected. And as I say, you need to be connected, so you need to find it interesting. Now, in my book, The Legends of Grimous Ironblood, I chose a couple of themes. I chose compassion and kindness, because I'm very intrigued by why people are kind and compassionate, and reaction to if someone is kind and compassionate to you. How do you deal with that? It's not always you think, well, what are they after? Can you be kind and compassionate without being after anything, without trying to manipulate people? Jealousy and hatred, always fascinated by that, why somebody will be jealous of somebody else. I'm always fascinated by that. And also the loss of a loved one and loneliness. And I think those themes are quite a lot of themes that you pick. They're very universal, so your audience can connect to that. Certainly a loss of a loved one, I guess most people go through that at some point in their life, and they will connect to that. And hopefully they will, find maybe not comfort, but they will connect to it on an emotional level, and that will add depth to your novel. So there we are. That's part 3 of Writing Fantasy: An Imp's Journey. Thank you so much for watching part 3 of Writing Fantasy: An Imp's Journey. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it useful. As I say, I'm not a writing expert, but I did enjoy writing my book, and I stumbled through it. I had to learn. I've been reading how to write books for a number of years now, and I've been writing on and off for a number of years. And I've really enjoyed doing this series because it means that I'm looking back at reference books that I've maybe not looked at for a while and refreshed my mind about how I actually put my book together and the journey that I went through, which is good because I obviously want to improve as a writer, and I think that's very important that you never stop learning. I'm actually going to be writing my second book, and so obviously there's certain things that I've learned, previously that I now am going to be incorporating into my second book, so hopefully it'll be even better. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. As I say, you can watch part 1 and part 2 on our YouTube channel. We've also got a website, thebottledimp.com, where you can find the episodes there, and we have a Facebook and Twitter page as well. Until the next time, remember, keep it unreal, especially the writing.